how much do you think things have changed in terms of misogyny in the media?
Well, I do think they've changed a lot. The personnel of the media has changed. It looks a wee bit more like the country, the people we see in the media. There's a lot more sources of information online, and all kinds of diversification of sources of information. And I think also what's very important is that now the exposure of the bad practices is a majority activity. It used to be like 10 or 20 crazy people over there in the corner. We were talking about sexual harassment, and we put it on the cover. No, first, in the early 70s, there were women at Cornell University who were trying to describe what happened to them on their summer job. They invented the term sexual harassment. We did a cover story about it, and we tried to be, not too controversial. We had...
This is a Ms. cover story?
A Ms. Magazine. Yeah, Ms. Magazine did a cover story about it using puppets, so we wouldn't be too controversial. Still, we were put off the newsstands in supermarkets and so on, right? Then Catherine McKinnon, our great legal theorist, feminist legal theorist, wrote sexual harassment into sex discrimination law, so it became a form for men or women, a form of sex discrimination. Then 3 women, all black women, brought cases, 2 against the government, I think, and 1 against a bank, and won their cases. So, this is a process. So this is what movements do. That's where we started. But the Me Too movement, and I have to say that you, as a male human being writing about, it just makes a huge, it is now a majority consciousness. Now, where do we need to go? I think we definitely need to go to the place where our bodies are our own, male or female. It's the basis of democracy. If we can't control our own physical selves, it's not democracy. But the counterweight to that is patriarchy, which means control, by definition, controlling reproduction. And if there's racism or caste, as in India, or any, other hierarchy, it gets even worse, because in order to perpetuate race or caste or class, you have to control women's bodies even more. It doesn't mean that women are all treated the same. I mean, historically, white women were sexually isolated, and black women were sexually exploited in this country. But it does mean that you have to control women's bodies in order to perpetuate race, class, caste, whatever, which is why sexism and racism and all these are intertwined. There's no such thing as being a feminist without being anti-racist, and there's no such thing as being successfully anti-racist unless you're also these things. There's no such thing as being a feminist without being anti-racist, anti-caste, hierarchical anything by birth, and vice versa, right? It just doesn't work. Right.
You snuck in another really important point there, several, but one that struck me was about the democratization of media platforms. And it has been striking to me how the narrative has been changed by the fact that if you are a powerful, wealthy person, you can no longer maintain a vice grip on the narrative just by having the right publicist who can get you on, Time and Newsweek in 60 minutes. And for so many years, some version of that was true. In the various iterations of American media, you could just buy out a few platforms, either literally buy or metaphorically buy with your influence. And that is slipping. And I think when I'm asked the question of sort of why now is a framing that I get a lot, which is a little bit of a reflection of some misapprehensions, I think, about everything that came before. The 2 things I talk about are that systemic change in terms of who controls the media and how many platforms there are. And more platforms, as you say, encourages more voices. And then also the fact that there was this history, and it's the recent history of Tarana Burke for years and years with the term Me Too, and the Cosby accusers coming back and back and back into the fore, even after years of opposition. We have seen how what you're talking about has built and built and built, and I assume you think will continue to build.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it goes global much faster now. It was always growing and in a movement sense, but now it is a majority consciousness, and we are beginning to get to the place where we are saying to ourselves, no, body invasion is, a more serious, but it isn't still legally. I mean, it is still probably more punished to invade your living room than to invade somebody's body. We still have a long way to go. And it's certainly more difficult to prove. Right?
One of the things that I talk about a lot is the distinction between activism and journalism. And for me, as an investigative reporter, it's very important to stress that I am not acting as an activist. I am interrogating the facts and am willing in each story I do to go wherever they might lead me. And of course, I have views about issues. I care about issues. But in a specific story, I am not advocating for any side. And I am inspired by activism that follows on that and takes the facts that I hopefully do a good job of fairly exposing and then runs with it and makes it into a movement. But I view the roles as separate. You have occupied both of those roles. Tell me about that transition.
Well, I kind of didn't have a choice, if you know what I mean. But I'm with you in the sense that I think as journalists we are utterly responsible for making facts as accurate as we possibly can and explaining who they came from and what the experience was and why we're writing this and what, full disclosure, that's absolutely. But if we separate fact and opinion, I think it's possible. I mean, in my case, the movement was beginning and burgeoning and so on, so it wasn't possible to separate them except in that way, which has to do with accuracy. Here's what I know, this is a fact, here's what I think. We are entitled to our own opinion, not to our own facts.
Bravo. That is the antidote to the enemy of the people line, right? We keep ourselves accountable and we stick to the truth.
No, what happened to me was that I reached the end of, I couldn't get published that much, and people were asking me to speak on campuses because the women's movement was burgeoning and so on. And no way could I even imagine speaking in public. It was, people become writers because we don't want to speak in public. And I went to a speech teacher, and she said, well, of course, you've been at two things, a dancer and a writer. No wonder, you don't want to talk. No wonder you're having such a hard time. But I couldn't get things published, and so in order to get the word out, I ended up inviting a friend of mine, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, who was like fearless, wonderful human being, to speak with me. And it turned out that was a great accident because having a black woman and a white woman together meant we got all kinds of... So when she had to stay home with her baby, then, or wanted to stay home with her baby, then Florence Kennedy took her place, and that, does anybody here remember Florence Kennedy, the great... Okay. There's a play about her that is, she was fan-fucking-tastic in every possible way. So it just grew out of journalism for me.